Today on the Awesome Marriage Podcast, we're talking about the effects of porn on a marriage. Is it ever okay? Is this something that can ever be used safely or legitimately? Today, we're going to answer those questions and talk about the effects of porn on a marriage. So we have to start out first by defining porn, because these days it is not limited to an adult video store or a specific magazine. It is widely accessible. It's in a lot of unsuspected places, and a lot of people view it as just entertainment. So, Dr. Kim, how are we going to define porn for our purposes today?
Yeah, I think it's any sexual subject matter that the intent of it is to cause sexual excitement or arousal. And in a lot of ways, that's defined by the user. I mean, I've had people that were addicted. Their porn was something that, in other words, just for example, the guy that I worked with years ago, and he, growing up, his grandparents got the old Sears Roebuck catalog. Well, this is a catalog that had a bunch of stuff, and it had pictures of women in their bras. That was his porn, and that continued to be what was porn for him. So I think a lot of it is, and that wasn't intended to be sexual, but for him it became sexual because that's what he was exposed to as a kid of 13, 14. And so I think sometimes it is defined by the user, but most of the porn that we see today in our culture is definitely intended to cause arousal, sexual excitement, things like that. But it certainly, in my opinion, doesn't have to be limited to something. It's a lot of how we define it in our own minds.
Wow, that's a really good point. And I wasn't expecting that Sears Roebuck catalog.
Yeah. Does anybody know what that was? A long time ago, there was a big store called Sears Roebuck, and that was before we had the internet, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So they sent this huge catalog every year in the fall for Christmas. I can remember my grandmother giving it to me in the toy section and circle things you like in it, that kind of thing. We did that with our kids, probably with the Toys R Us catalog, and now that's not around anymore. So anyway,
no, that's not.
But I think something like that it's very easy to see how someone that could have been an issue for somebody.
Yeah, sure. And I think it's a good thing to remember. It's not new. It's been around, but it is a lot more accessible because we have so many places. It seems like from what you're saying, anywhere that there could be images shared or published, there could be potentially porn. And so obviously we have a ton of places we can find it now, any platform on the internet, and it's impossible to avoid that it's out there.
It's interesting when you said it's been around forever. I can remember looking at studying some stuff when we were doing. I was doing a kind of a archaeological type thing, and the professor that was teaching it, and he was just talking about the sexual depictions that were etched on cave walls.
Oh, wow.
I mean, there was what we would consider porn on there, people having sex. And that was, back then, I guess the only place you could do is go to a cave. Now you just pull your phone out or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's a great definition. And I like that there's a little bit of a challenge in there too, because it could be something unexpected. It could be something that a person is using, even if it wasn't intended to elicit that response. And so then, we'd have to define that ourselves and really search ourselves. It also could be something that's overtly sexual and obviously intended to arouse. And there's plenty of both of those.
Yeah. And I think the one that I was kind of mentioned with the catalog or something like that, it's kind of easy for someone to say, well, is that really porn? Because it's not like this other stuff that people are calling porn. Well, I think it goes back to what you just said. It's what's in our heart. Are we looking at it that way? Are we lusting over that? Are we, is that causing sexual arousal in us? And so it doesn't have to be what the world might consider porn to be porn for us.
Yeah, that's certainly true. And I think about things like in my world, in my beach town where we live, there's a lot of surf magazines, and you'll see bikini ads in there and stuff like that.
Sure.
We're going to want to rip that out before the boys read that in my house. And it also brings me to think about in Matthew, when Jesus talks about what lust is, what adultery is. And he says that, everyone's heard, don't commit adultery. But also when you have lust in your heart and you're looking at somebody with that view, that is also like adultery. And I think it's one important piece of this is there's an objectification piece to it.
Absolutely.
That I think we'll get more into, but there is, that's dishonoring and exploiting another person. Objectifying a person is never in line with God's purposes, because people are all human, all created in God's image.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, and I think that's such a good point because it really does. And I think a lot of times guys that I've worked with are single and addicted to porn and think, well, we get married, well, I won't have to use porn anymore. But then
Oh,
they see how it affects their marriage, how they begin to look at their spouse, looking
hmm
at her not in developing sex the way God intended it, but almost she becomes the object because I'm not
mm,
looking at porn anymore. And she becomes so it's there's so many things that that go along with it. It can complicate relationships, make it complicated for us. It's just
hmm
there's no redeeming value in it.
yeah. No, there's definitely not. It is not in line with God's heart for people at all.
Yeah, and I think that people go, well, so Jesus was a prude. Well, he wasn't because
Mm,
he created God. I mean, he created sex anyway.
hmm
So, but I think what Jesus is saying, man, this is not good either. Don't just define it by this. It really goes back to what maybe go inside of you that nobody
hmm
sees that you, but that's affecting your heart. That's affecting who you are and how your actions and words are going to be. And so
mm,
I think it's just Jesus looking deeper into us because he knows us so well because he created us to
hmm
know that's dangerous too. It's not going to
yeah.
be good for you.
Absolutely. So I think this begs a question. If one spouse is using porn, and is that always going to affect their marriage, or can it just stay private, something they do on their own?
I think, from my perspective, in marriage, it's deceit. You're hiding something from your spouse,
Hmm
and hiding it doesn't keep it from affecting your marriage.
Mm,
It creeps into your sex life in your marriage. I've had guys that can try to do both, and then they're in a sex relationship with their wife, and then they're visualizing someone else that was in
mm,
this porn that they watched, and then how what they see in that porn. Definitely is just another person is just an object to be used, and so
hmm
to make that transition to your marriage, I just think it causes so many problems that I've never seen in my experience anyone that um, viewed porn on a regular basis that had a great sexual relationship in their marriage.
Hmm. Never.
Yeah, I can't
Hmm.
think of any of them like that.
hmm Yeah. And I think
It,
really, I mean, if if one person is keeping that secret, like you're saying, it is deceit. And if the goal of anything that we're doing is to not let our spouse know about it, that is going to create like first of all a barrier between us, but also between
yes,
God, because being dishonest is always going to start cutting us off from the Holy Spirit and conviction. And so I think I've heard people describe like if you were to get caught doing like the worst thing you could get caught doing, it's actually the best thing for you because it sets you free from that deceit.
mm,
And so in this situation, if you're talking about like, well, the best thing would be to have no deceit and no secrets. But then if you were trying to keep it secret, the next best thing would be to get caught so you don't have to have that secret and that wall dividing you.
absolutely. Because I think you're right. It's there. It's a wall. It's a division between, even if your spouse doesn't know.
Mhm.
And most of my experience has been that you eventually get caught. I don't know
Mhm.
whether we get careless or maybe we want to get caught, wherever. I'm not going into the psychology of that, but and then you get caught, and then you got to deal with that with your spouse. That if you're
Mhm.
honest with them, then they may find out you've been doing this for years in your marriage, and
Mhm.
then how does that affect them? How does that make them feel that they weren't good enough for you?
Mhm.
Which usually is where a woman goes with it. That I wasn't never good enough for you, so you went to this, and so
Mhm.
it's just it always affects a marriage, in my opinion.
Yeah. Yeah, so you've mentioned some of the impacts. Are there any other ways that it impacts the marriage or the other spouse?
I think it takes our focus off each other. Um, it does kind of like I said, it makes a wife wonder why her husband looks at that when he has her. And I've had this almost exact words said by
Mhm.
almost probably 90% of the women that I've worked with in
Mm.
marriage situations where the husband was into pornography.
Mhm.
Um, I think it takes the beauty out of sex. I think
Mm.
that God gave it is a gift, and porn's not part of that. I mean, it's just not
Mhm.
part of that gift. So you really look at, okay, what does God have you? What is this gift He's given us with sex and marriage? Why is it different in marriage than outside of marriage or pornography or things like that to distort it? Because that's not part of God's plan.
Mhm.
God's plan is a husband and wife together,
Mhm.
receiving that gift together, enjoying each other. Well, that
Mhm.
you don't need porn in the middle of that.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a good point because I think we're kind of speaking to both spouses in this. And
Yeah.
so the one who's been betrayed by the porn use is going to be really hurt. And I've seen that a lot. It's really hard to overcome. It feels, from what I've heard, it feels similar to having been cheated on, because it feels like it's this completely outside thing that I didn't know was part of our relationship. And now it's been on the side, it's been hiding, and finding out about that's devastating.
Yeah, I think most women, when they find out that, use Jesus's definition, that it's same as adultery to them, very much so. And I think Jesus knows how things like that affect us. And I know we're talking about men going outside, but the majority of people that use porn, especially the visual type, are men. And so I think that's where it lands most of the time.
Yeah. Although the gap is closing, statistically speaking, which is not great. I mean, there's not a good...
No, but I think that we get, and you can speak to this, Lindsay, as a woman, but it seems like the women I see, it's more the romance novels or the things like 50 Shades of Grey or something like that, that still has a little bit of maybe romance to it. In addition to whatever else is more explicit.
I can't really speak to that, actually. I'm just not enamored by things like that. I think I had some exposure to maybe lighter porn at some points, and it earlier when I was younger as a teen, and I was just so like put off by it. It just made me feel so, I was shocked. Like I was very caught off guard, and it was in a social setting where I was like, this is super weird, super strange to me. Obviously mostly male, so I felt incredibly uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And I didn't really want to have that feeling again. I had certainly temptations to deal with stuff like that at other times, but it just was such an off-putting experience to me, that all those books and stuff, that's not something I've ever wanted to really dabble in, because, there were some very, very chaste types of romance novels that I enjoyed when I was getting married and around the time of getting married. Like some were really like wonderful Christian books, actually.
Yeah.
But because the way that I was tempted to make those kind of storylines of fantasy to compare Brian against, I was like, this is not healthy for me. So I realized, some books that were great books, there's nothing explicit, there's nothing bad about the book. But for me, it kind of goes back to our definition that we started with.
Absolutely.
It was a temptation to sort of lust or fantasize over an ideal of like a fictional situation. Yeah. And to think that my real life marriage wasn't as good because it wasn't fulfilling that fictional, character.
That's a really, really good point, because you're setting up, it's almost like that, we set something up as this model that nobody could ever live up to. But when you're writing, you can make that person into whatever you want that person to be. Sure. So that makes total sense.
Yeah, and I'm kind of glad I had to work that out, because when you asked the question and named the titles you named, I was like, my head wasn't there because I haven't done that. But then I had to connect the dots to like, oh yeah, you can use legitimate things like the Sears Roebuck catalog or like Redeeming Love, the novel, and use it in an illegitimate way if it is causing a fantasy or a lust.
Right. Even though it may not have been intended to that.
Exactly.
In writing, sometimes it's part of the storyline. I get that. But I think that's what you did is what I think sometimes it's hard for us to do, or we don't do. And that is to say, this is not good. I don't need this, and to really make that decision to step away from it. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it was pretty clear to me how, even though this was fine for a lot of other people to read, and it was not, explicit or anything, it still was harmful. And I realized my marriage had a lot going against it already. And so we didn't need any more things. So I better cool it.
That's a really good point. Yeah. I don't know. It'd be interesting. I have not really dealt with many women that have deal with this, very few, but I know it's a growing issue, and probably we'll begin to see it more pop up in the counseling room too.
Yeah. Well, I would love to talk about some common myths of pornography. One of the listener questions we have gotten talks about a spouse who is thinking they're doing a spouse a favor by using porn instead of asking for sex. So I feel like that's one myth.
Yeah.
Is that a favor? I think we've been pretty clear that it's not.
Yeah. No, I don't know. Yeah, I think one, because I think it's just such a cheap imitation for one thing. When you
Yeah.
have the real thing that God gave you, why would you go to a cheap imitation? You know.
Hmm. Yeah. So, what are some of the other myths? I feel like there are quite a few.
Well, I think that if you just look at sitcoms or things like that where they talk about it, it's like everybody does it. It's
Mm.
harmless. We laugh at it. It's
Hmm.
funny, uh, but it doesn't show the consequences of sin.
Hmm.
It doesn't
Hmm.
show what happens to that person as they get in a relationship or as
Hmm.
they get married or things like that. I think it's I was looking as I was doing some research for this, amazed at how many articles there were on the internet that were positive about porn.
Hmm.
And then you look at the source and you think, oh yeah, well I see why that's where they're coming from. One, it wasn't a Christian perspective, and it
Hmm.
wasn't even a health perspective. And I think that things are out there though, those lies that we can believe as truth, and they want us to believe those lies as truth. And I think it's just
Hmm.
another place. I think the enemy is doing a lot of things right now in the area of sexuality, pornography,
Hmm.
um, things like that. Things that we see all the time in counseling, that
Hmm.
we hear our friends are dealing with, or couples are dealing with. So I think that's all there. And really, I can't think of anything that's positive about porn.
Hmm.
Obviously, I mean, you just can't think anything it is. And I know there's
No.
people out there that are going to disagree with us, but
Right.
write me, let me know.
Yeah.
I'll,
Yeah.
I'll be open minded. If you really think it is, let me know.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I feel like I've seen that perspective represented more and more also. Um, and I can't figure out where that really lands because I don't think when you get to the bottom of it, I don't think there's anything redeeming. But I think one of the big myths that really, really hits me wrong is that it doesn't hurt anyone
Hmm.
because, we'll get into a little bit more about the impacts on the user, but also it is certainly impacting the spouse. And I think it's really important to talk about the fact that it hurts the person who has been acting in the porn. And that is something that I feel like there's been some cultural kind of pushback to say, like, from some of the people who are part of producing them. No, we want to do this. This is empowering for us. And I don't know about that perspective. That may be the case for some, but there are many, many who did not get into it on purpose, who are trafficked, smuggled, who are doing that against their will, who have been coerced, who have been given no option to say no. Um, and so, in all those situations, there's a person essentially, like, could be raped on camera. There's a lot of ways that this is very harmful for the people you're viewing. And
Absolutely.
in addition, just by watching, you're objectifying them. You're adding to this billion-dollar industry. You're adding to the demand for more because people aren't just watching one, you know? So I think that idea that you kind of keep it separate or secret or something like that, it's still already harmed somebody before it's gotten to you. So that's completely a myth I think we need to bust.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's interesting what you said when you're talking about if someone was actually being raped or something like that. I
Mm-hmm.
think I don't know how to say this. I really thought about it. You said, but there's different levels of porn. There are
Mm-hmm.
things like if it involves someone getting hurt, or
Mm-hmm.
those kind of things, that's a different level than just a sex act or a
Mm-hmm.
person without clothes on, something like
Mm-hmm.
that. And so, if you're looking at those things where someone's being hurt, how does that affect you? Do you want to carry that over into your marriage or to a relationship? And so I think it
Mm-hmm.
complicates it there. And I think one of the things I think addictiveness is porn is for a lot of people. You go to step one, to kind of like with maybe some drugs. You start with a minor drug, and all of a sudden
Mm-hmm.
you're hooked on something really bad. Well, same thing with porn. Some
Mm-hmm.
people, it seems like, well, that doesn't satisfy anymore, so I'll go to this level and this level, and where do you end up? And
Mm-hmm.
it's not gonna be good.
Yeah. Yeah, and I've heard it compared to a drug a lot of times, and a lot of that's based on a lot of new research that's coming out. That
Yes,
is, I mean, there's pages of documentation um, that are confirming a lot of these mental factors that go into it. It does hit your brain like a drug. You want more, and you want harder stuff. And also, there are some other things. There's a lot of indications that it's being used as like sort of a coping technique. Maybe you feel stressed or overwhelmed in your life, and so you turn to porn as kind of an outlet. And I've not been addicted to anything except for food. I did suffer from a food addiction for a long time. And having that, it was like I had no skills in my like toolbox to deal with big feelings, except for to literally stuff it down.
Just to stuff it down.
Yeah. And so speaking to that, like I know because I in researching for this topic, I read a lot about how there is that component of it. It's like this is the only way I know how to deal with feelings that are too big and scary is go to this old familiar thing. And so I could understand that sort of impulse. But when I was in that addiction, I felt awful about it every second, all the time.
Yeah.
And so then if you only have one coping mechanism and it's the thing that you feel awful about, where does that leave you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think knowing if that is there, you need to reach out and get help. If you feel like you're in that trap, get someone that can help you. Because a lot of us don't know. We cope, and all of a sudden maybe it was porn was there when someone was in their teens or whatever, and they used that, and that became a habit of the way to deal with it. But you don't have to stay in that cycle. You can break that cycle and learn how to deal with stress or pain in a healthy way, a much better way for you. So yeah, I think you're right. The whole it does hurt you. I think there's shame involved, just because it's not God's plan. I mean, I don't think, if you were in a church and the pastor said, "Hey, all you porn users, stand up today." I mean, what are you going to do? I mean, I think there's, I think in that situation, there is some shame in that. And I don't think any pastor's going to do that.
No.
But I'm just, I think there is that shame and I think we kind of push that aside. And you kind of downplay that, or some people I've worked with really feel the shame, and they feel after using porn, they feel guilt and shame and dirty and never do it again. And yet, unless you really take some steps, unless God works a miracle, you're probably gonna do it again because it's addictive to you. And so it's that love-hate relationship that you get with porn. And I think each time you go through that, you go down a little farther.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, there's just the fact that anything kept secret is going to stay strong. Anything that we expose, like in the book of James, and the Bible tells us that when we confess, we're healed. And so there's something healing about not letting things stay secret. And so for most people, like you said, yeah, if the pastor said that on Sunday, they would not be standing up. And,
no,
but realistically, statistically, it would be a lot of people.
Right. Statistically, it probably would be 3/4 of the congregation. If you were really honest about if you ever looked at porn in your life, it probably would be 100% or 99 something, even if it was inadvertent. And the stats now keep getting lower of a boy's first introduction to porn. And it was at 11. Then I saw something not too long ago that had it at 8. And so I think it's just because the prevalence and the ease of it. And sometimes kids are very innocent, and that's why you've got to monitor them on internet and all kind of things like that, because they could very innocently type something in and something come up that you don't want them to see.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And then if they know that this is something embarrassing or shameful, they're not going to want to talk about it. And then there you have that shame cycle.
Exactly.
Yeah. Were there any other mental health impacts that you know about or have seen?
I think depression, and I think it just goes along with that, all those kind of things. I think anxiety, whether it's anxious I'm going to get caught or anxiety about that. And the things that we talked about, women as objects, disordered view of sex. I mean, I think that all goes in. I think that just complicates us getting to God's plan for sex. And what that really is and what that gift is, because the pornography is so far away from that in so many ways. So I think those are, but I think there's very real mental health issues that come along with that.
Yeah, certainly so. And so I'm wondering, so we've talked a lot about how this impacts the marriage and the person using it and all these things, but we also know and believe that God wants to heal and restore. So
absolutely,
for the person you have seen stuck in this addiction or in this cycle, what is the first step? How do they get out?
I think your first step is like in everything else. AA has it right. You got to admit you got a problem. You've got to admit it, and you've got to be willing to admit it's to someone else that you have a problem.
Yes.
Then you get it on the table. Then you can decide, begin to see. I would go to counseling. I would get some input from someone. If it's a real addiction, an SA group or something like that would probably be very helpful. But prayer, it's accountability. I think is very important, and the accountability person cannot be your spouse. It just, it just can't be. You've got to find somebody outside, and you got to find somebody that loves you enough to get in your face every week and say, "Hey, did you look at something you shouldn't?" And that's going to be willing to be tough with you, because you need that tough love that loves you enough to be tough with you.
Yeah.
So I think it's admitting you have a problem, and then what are your steps that you need to take? Accountability's got to be a part of it. How do you protect yourself? What do you put on your devices or not put on your devices? I've had one person that went to a phone, and all he can do on it is call, and I think he can text, and that's it. That's it. And so
awesome.
he locked it down,
Yeah.
And so I think whatever it takes to get rid of that. And I think it's easy to fool ourselves. I actually had one person one time that got to porn through the Bible app, because he clicked on a link which took him to the internet, which he was staying away from. And once he got to the internet, it was like, okay, here I go. Wow. So you can't fool yourself, and I think that's where the accountability comes in. I think Covenant Eyes is good, because you've got a report that's going to your friend, your person that gets that report and shows what your activity has been. There's other good things out there that you could Google and find out things to restrict your access. But it's a process, and I've seen it happen both ways with it. I've said some people that they were so, when they finally got there, so disgusted with it, so ready to change, so realizing how harmful it was, that they really were able to walk away from it. And then I've seen other people that continue to struggle with it. They know it's not good for them. They've come to that decision, but they're getting away from it is a process. And I think it's something that we have to realize we're always vulnerable. No matter how long you've been away from it, the enemy wants to get you back in. And so you can be blindsided with something. Something might pop up on your computer screen. You may see some person or whatever it is, but there's triggers there. And so you got to be prepared for those. So, that my choice when those things are in front of me is not to pursue those, it's to run away from them and get away from it.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. I think just introducing maybe some different sort of like go-tos, like find some other thing. Like if it's like, I know I just need to walk outside and get away from the device, just set it down. And, these are things I just had to do with overcome my addiction. It's not the same thing, but there's some impulses. There's certain situations that are always going to trap you, always going to trigger you, because it's a very habituated activity. And so when the thing, like, you kind of have that first little itch in your mind. You're like, I think I'm gonna hit the drive-through or whatever it is. Like, okay, are you going to entertain that, or are you going to shut that down? And sometimes shutting that down means you have to have a backup plan. I'm not even going to get my car right now. I'm going to take a walk around the block. I'm going to breathe some fresh air. I'm going to evaluate all these things. Got to have as many tools as you can possibly get.
Absolutely. And knowing that you have a choice. I mean, sometimes I think that urge comes and we don't realize we still have a choice there of which way we go and what we do. Yes. And I think going back to what we're talking about, say it is stress related, that your stress is your trigger. Okay, find out some other things to do with stress. Exercise is a good alternative to that. Anything else like prayer is a good alternative to that. Just anything that to make that your go-to instead of the porn. There are so many healthy ways to deal with stress, and finding something that works for you instead of choosing something like porn that's unhealthy and is really in the long run may complicate your stress.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not going to help. That's for sure. I think that, I love when you talk about the way things affect our brain and like our worn out paths that we use in our minds to get to the things we've done a million times. Those are easy roads because we're very accustomed to them. The new way, the different way is a hard path. It's like going on a hike instead of a stroll. But the more you do it, the more you do the new behavior, the easier it'll come.
Absolutely, absolutely. Because it does, and when you bring up the brain, it is, it's an addiction,
Mm-hmm.
and I think we know about the neuroplasticity of the brain, and
Mm-hmm.
so this long term pornography use can be similar to long term drug use because of how it changes our brain,
Mm-hmm.
and so that's why I think maybe the level of it is depends why some people struggle more coming out of it than others,
Mm-hmm.
but it's going to be worth it. I mean,
Yeah.
if you were on a drug and it was killing you, I think you'd make the effort. Hopefully, you would.
Yeah.
And
I hope
and
so.
so, look at porn in a way that this is not giving you the life God designed for you. And what do you need to do to get away from it? And there are
Yeah.
always answers. Um, there's always help. There's even places you can go, Christian places you can go where they deal with this and can help you. So
Mm-hmm.
there's always an answer there. And so if you feel like you're stuck in it, um, you don't have to be. You don't have to stay stuck. And there's nothing, when I've seen people that have been addicted to porn and they go through the process and they get on the other side, they just look different. They just look
Mm.
different. There's that
Mm-hmm.
heaviness that was there is
Mm-hmm.
gone. There's just something different about them. And I think there's the victory. And then all of a sudden God can use you to maybe somebody at work or a friend that
Mm-hmm.
confides in you. Hey, you used to look at porn and you don't anymore. Or I'm kind of stuck there. What'd you do? And all of a
Mm-hmm.
sudden you have a chance to help somebody else, which I think is how God completely redeems something. You go through
Mm-hmm.
something you wish you hadn't had to go through, then God uses to help somebody else. And it's like, okay, that was definitely worth it.
Yeah, that's so good. That's so good. And I love too that it's like there's purpose. Like God didn't create you just to keep struggling, struggling. He created you to be out there helping other people, ministering to someone in some way. And that could be it. The thing you think is the worst thing could end up being the most
Absolutely.
helpful thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I've seen people do that. I had a guy that I knew, and he was really into the sexual sin and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And he has small groups that he leads now, and um, he's got a ministry now helping people. And someone like that's kind of like with AA, where they use people that have been alcoholics before.
Mm-hmm.
Someone that's been a porn addict and now is helping lead groups to help people come out of that. He knows where you've been, and those are
Mm-hmm.
around. There's people
Mm-hmm.
that do that. You can find a group like that. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I think with any addiction, it's best when you can work with someone that's been there because
Mm-hmm.
they know your lies, they know the
Yeah.
deceits, they know what you go through, they know
Mm-hmm.
the things that you're going to say to try to cover for yourself because they've been there.
Yeah.
And so I think those are really, really helpful.
Yeah, that's good. That's super encouraging too.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Always hope.
Yes, there is always hope. So this has been a heavy conversation about just all about the effects of porn on marriage, on the user, and how to get out of it. Do you have any final piece of advice for our listeners, Dr. Kim?
Yeah, I hope this has made some people think. I think it's easy to buy into what our culture says because it's
Mm-hmm.
easy sometimes. But I think if you go back and you really want to see what God has for you in marriage, in sexual relationship, read the Song of Solomon.
Mm-hmm.
Read how erotic and how arousing that can be, and that is a husband and a wife. You
Mm-hmm.
don't need outside things. They didn't put whatever in that book for them
Mm-hmm.
to go to besides each other. And I
Mm-hmm.
think knowing that God's plan is going to be best, it's not only going to be healthier for you mentally, physically, all those kind of things, but it's going to grow your marriage. It's going to knit
Mm-hmm.
you closer together. And so I would just say, if you're caught up in porn, um, let today be the day you say, I'm gonna get out of this, and tell somebody. Maybe it's a
Mm-hmm.
best friend. Maybe you're not quite ready to tell your spouse yet. I think eventually you need to,
Mm-hmm.
but reach out to somebody and say, I need help. I need you to help me be accountable. I need you to help me take the first step, whatever that is. And maybe go into a Christian counselor, but take a step.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's a great place to land. Take a step. There is a step you can take.
Right.
And and I love this is I'm going to quote your words to you, Dr. Kim, but I love that you shared before that sometimes if you want to start with prayer and you are praying for something that you don't want yet, just pray that honestly to God. Like, hey, I want to stop doing this, but I still want to keep doing it. And God will meet you because He already
Absolutely.
knows. He already knows.
Yeah, I don't know why we think that if we don't say it out loud, God doesn't know, but He
Yeah,
does, and so
He
you
knows.
might as well get because I think there's something better about us verbalizing it to God.
Yes.
You know,
Yeah.
He knows anyway, but there's just something therapeutic about that, of just being totally honest with God.
Yes. And not just waiting until he answers the prayer by boom, taking away the addiction.
Right.
That's
And he's
not a
not
great road.
No, and unfortunately, we're probably going to get pornography. I think is something that's always going to be here. We live in a sinful world. There's so much money to be made, or is being made out of porn.
Oh,
so it's
so
not going away. So we have to figure out how to deal with it. And I think for me as a dad, a granddad, and with boys involved in that, I want to do everything I can to help them make those right choices so that they don't get into that addiction. And so I talk pretty openly about it, all those kind of things sexually with them. Sometimes they don't want to talk about it, but that's okay. They do. And I think in the big picture, they appreciate that. And I'm not ever condemning with them. It's just, hey, let's talk about this. Tell me. And a lot of times we'll just talk about what's going on with some of their friends and stuff, you know, and the things that they've either had to deal with or had to walk away from. And, you know, just helping them realize that they have a choice. And there's some choices that are going to be much better than others for you. But I always want them to realize they have a choice. They're not always going to make the best choice, the perfect choice. But knowing you have a choice and you get in a problem, then you can say, hey, I need to make a different choice here.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah. I wish everybody had somebody to talk to like that, but they can listen to you today. So that helps.
Yes, they can. Yeah.
That's good. That's good. Well, next week, we're going to be talking about ways to heal your marriage after porn use and rebuild trust. So we're going to be getting into more details about how to protect your marriage, how to rebuild trust after porn, and rebuild intimacy. Please don't miss that episode because there's a road to hope for the individual and for the marriage, and we want to share that with you. Make sure that you are following us on Instagram, Facebook, and following Dr. Kim on TikTok, where he has a very, very famous video about the dangers of porn in marriage. And what?
I think we got over 1 million on that one.
Gosh, that's so
and
much.
It certainly wasn't because everybody agreed with me.
Right, right. Oh, gosh. Well, make sure you're following us on all the places. Have a great day and do something awesome for your marriage today.